Investigative techniques have come leaps and bounds in the last few decades, and countless cold cases have been solved as a result. However, some cases continue to baffle investigators decades after they occurred. Number 5. December 29th, 1989, started like any other for the residents of Houston, Texas. People began making their way to work and going about their daily routines. A shocking discovery would turn the humdrum of daily life on its head and give way to one of Houston's most mysterious unsolved cases. At around 7:15 a.m., passers-by noticed a woman slumped over. Some sources state that she was on the steps, while others say she was on a walkway. Either way, the woman was found near the Charter Bank at 5433 Westheimer Road in Houston. Passers-by rushed to her aid, hoping that she'd simply had an accident and needed assistance. Unfortunately, it was too late. The woman was deceased, and within minutes, the Houston Police Department were called to the scene. The woman was not carrying any ID with her, and an initial identification was unable to be made. Her body was transported back to the coroner's office, where a full investigation could begin. Her autopsy showed that her PMI was 8 to 10 hours, and the Houston Police Department set about scouring missing person reports to try and make an identification. The coroner noted that the woman was Hispanic, between 19 and 35 years old, with long, thick black curly hair and brown eyes. She was 5'3" to 5'5", 155 to 165 pounds, and had a small half-moon scar below her right knee, and a small fine scar on her right forearm. Police were unable to make any comparisons to missing person records, and decided to publicize her details, hoping that someone would come forward and recognize her. The Houston police, along with the coroner, released her physical details, and that she was also found wearing black corduroy trousers, a white pullover, black socks, white underwear, a white bra, and black lace-up shoes. A handwritten schedule was also found close to her body. Despite all of this information at hand, the Houston Police Department struggled to make an identification. And almost 33 years later, the identity of the Harris County Jane Doe continues to baffle investigators and experts. She was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, and Houston police hope that very soon they'll be able to put a name on her headstone. A DNA sample was obtained from a blood sample that was taken in 1989. And investigators are hopeful that forensic science and forensic genetic genealogy may finally bring answers. Testing is still ongoing in regards to her DNA, and anyone with information is urged to contact the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences on 713-796-6774, quoting case number ML898294. Or the Houston Police Department on 1713-308-3616, quoting case number 121-65089. Number 4. On August 9, 1923, the quiet and serenity of Milford Haven in Connecticut was shattered by the body of a 20-year-old man who was discovered on the Milford Townpike in West Haven. Passers-by rushed to the scene, wondering what was going on, and that's when they discovered his body. The police were called to the scene, and well-meaning passers-by were shooed away so that the investigation could begin. The man's body was transported back to the coroner's office, and right away the police began their investigation. The coroner determined that the man had been deceased for around 2 months, and that he was around 20 years old, although he could have been older or younger. Due to the level of decomposition, not much else could be determined. In his report, the coroner noted that the man had been found wearing a brown striped suit and had a chauffeur's cap under one arm. Despite this information, no one came forward to claim the man. That was until a known serial killer named Carl Panzram entered the picture. Panzram gave varying accounts, and his story often changed. He claimed that he had likely met the man between June and July of 1923, but he couldn't be sure. He told investigators that he believed the man to be of Jewish descent and that he was the son or nephew of a New York policeman. Without a name, the police found themselves at square one. The little information that Panzram had given ultimately led nowhere. Almost 100 years later, investigators are still no closer to determining who this mysterious man was, and he remains one of the most perplexing John Does of the early 1900s. Anyone with information is asked to contact the New Haven Police Department on 203-9496-6316. Number 3. To the outside world, 39-year-old Charles Morgan lived the perfect life. He had a successful escrow business and shared his home in Tucson, Arizona with his wife Ruth and his children. His business was going from strength to strength, and the future looked bright for Morgan. However, one bizarre evening in March of 1977 would turn the lives of the Morgan family upside down and send the Tucson police on a wild investigation that remains unsolved to this day. On March 22, 1977, Charles bundled two of his daughters into the car and dropped them off at school as usual. Charles and his daughters waved goodbye, not knowing what was around the corner. That evening, he failed to return home, and his wife, Ruth, waited patiently for him to come back. It wasn't until March 25, 1977, that Ruth heard a desperate knock at the door, and it was Charles. His hands and feet had been tied with cable ties, and he was missing one of his shoes. Ruth brought her husband inside and asked him what had happened and where he had been. Charles refused to talk and motioned for Ruth to grab a pen and paper. Ruth watched as Charles wrote that he could not talk because his throat had been painted with a substance that would cause him harm if he ingested it. Over the course of a few days, Charles rested and his voice soon came back. He told Ruth that they were after him and ordered her to move his car so that they wouldn't know he was home. Of course, Ruth pressed him for more information, but Charles refused. Charles became incredibly paranoid and told Ruth that he'd been working as an informant for the federal government, giving them information on organized crimes that had been happening in Tucson, Arizona. It turns out that Charles had been involved with the local organized crime gang and had been helping them launder money through his escrow business. Had Charles turned on his crime gang and become an informant? Just as Ruth was getting close to these answers, Charles disappeared again. On June 7, 1977, Charles vanished into thin air once more. Ruth waited and waited, hoping that Charles would come back, as he had 2 months earlier, but instead she received a strange phone call just days after he went missing. On the other end of the phone, an unknown woman relayed a message to Ruth, saying, quote, "Chuck is all right, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Part of this Bible passage reads, quote, "Men are afraid of high places and terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." The caller has never been identified to this day. Shortly after this mysterious phone call, Charles's body was found in an isolated part of the desert. On his person, investigators found a $2 bill with 7 Spanish names written from A to G on it. Also on the note was Ecclesiastes 12, and part of the passage was marked with arrows, forming a serial number. There was also a map showing roads in Tucson and the Mexico border. Investigators desperately tried to wrap their heads around this clue, but failed to make anything of it. With all of this evidence, the Tucson authorities ruled that Charles had taken his own life, and that's where the case sits today. Over the years, many people have tried to dive into Charles's cold case, but so far, nobody has been able to solve it. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Tucson police at 520-791-5032. Number 2. As we approach the 100th anniversary of the Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills case, investigators still find themselves baffled as to what happened that cool September evening in 1922. Despite rapid advancements in technology, we're still no closer to finding out what happened to Edward and Eleanor. On September 10, 1922, Raymond Schneider and Pearl Baumer were taking a romantic walk down DeRussie Lane in Franklin Township, New Jersey, when they discovered something that would change their lives forever. Underneath a crabapple tree, the two lovers found the bodies of a man and a woman. Their faces had been concealed, and they were laid side by side on their backs. Shocked at what they had found, the young couple ran to fetch the nearest police officer, and soon an investigation began. After searching the bodies and the belongings found nearby, the police were able to establish that the bodies belonged to Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. Edward was a reverend at the local church, and he'd been having an affair with Eleanor. Surrounding the couple were ripped up love letters and Edward's driving license. It was clear that an altercation had happened, and that possibly the two had been confronted about their affair. The coroner determined that the two had passed away at around 10 p.m. on September 9, 1922. But as this was the 1920s, not much forensic evidence could be recovered. Unfortunately, the crime scene had been heavily tampered with by the time the police had arrived. During the subsequent investigation, people gathered to get a glimpse at the crabapple tree, and some people began taking morbid souvenirs from the scene. This meant that the police now had very little evidence to work with, and had to dedicate their time to keep people away from the infamous crabapple tree on DeRussie Lane. The police quickly turned their attention to Edward and Eleanor's spouses, James Mills and Frances Hall. The two became suspects, and then a suspect came forward that helped to solidify the case. Jane Gibson was a pig farmer whose land was close to the crabapple tree on DeRussie Lane. She testified that on the night of September 9th, she saw 4 people gathered and arguing before the argument erupted. One of the 4 fell to the ground, and Jane ran back to her house as she was scared. Unfortunately, Jane's testimony was considered untrustworthy in court, and it could not be used in the case. Jane Gibson told investigators that she'd seen Frances Hall, Edward's wife, and Henry Carpenter, Frances's cousin, at the scene that night. Due to a lack of evidence, charges against Frances and Henry were dropped, and since the infamous trial, the case has gone cold. Will the 100th anniversary of this crime bring about new evidence? Anyone with information is asked to contact the Franklin Township Police at 856-694-1415. Number 1. Despite being the Australian Prime Minister for just 1 year, Harold Holt has left his mark on the world in what is one of Australia's most mysterious missing person cases. December 17, 1967, was a hot and humid day in Portsea, Victoria. Harold's holiday home was located in Portsea, and the Australian government had just had their last meeting of the year. Wanting to make the most of the good weather, Harold ventured out of his house and onto the beach. Harold was a keen swimmer, and those around him remarked how he was the typical Australian bloke. When he wasn't going about his official business, Harold would often be seen swimming, spearfishing, and diving on the many beautiful beaches that Australia has to offer. However, in December of 1967, Harold had just undergone shoulder surgery, and the surgeon had advised him to take it easy, which meant no swimming. Harold ignored the surgeon's advice, and just days after his surgery, he was out and about. On December 17th, Harold walked down the beach and gently waded into the water and began swimming. Others on the beach that day noted that there was high and strong undercurrent in the water, something that was unusual for the area. This did little to deter Harold, and he continued swimming out to sea. He was so confident in his abilities to navigate the water that he told a friend, quote, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." Friends watched as Harold swam further and further, till all of a sudden he disappeared. A CNN article notes that one witness, quote, said that she saw the water become very turbulent around him, very suddenly, and appeared to boil, and these conditions seemed to swamp him. Beachgoers tried to tell Harold to swim back to shore, but unfortunately it was too late. The Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Army joined in on the search for the missing Prime Minister, but found no sign of him. As the days passed, the searches intensified, but Harold Holt was nowhere to be seen. Immediate conclusions were drawn, suggesting that he'd encountered trouble out at sea. But there are some bizarre conspiracy theories that have popped up following his disappearance. One theory is that Harold had been working as a spy for either the Russian or Chinese governments, and that he'd been picked up by a submarine while out at sea. Was Harold Holt a spy for a foreign government, or is there a more straightforward explanation to this baffling cold case? Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.